Thank you very much. So when Fran asked me to speak, the first thing I asked myself was, what do you mean by direct consumer tests, Fran? What do you want me to cover? And I think the fact that I started with that question probably speaks to how fast this field is evolving and how quickly it's changing and how the ground shifts under our feet and how they're not one thing, but many. So I thought back to where I might start. So I don't have answers. I'm really going to air some reflections, some questions, some things that I come across in my daily practice in the hope that you will all improve upon what I say and that we can have a really constructive conversation about how to bring this into some kind of collaborative dialogue. So, I said, where should I start? Well, I'm going to start with the first one that I really came across as a GP approximately quite a very long time ago, which were radical in their days, groundbreaking, but which we now absolutely take for granted. And those are pregnancy tests, pregnancy tests. And I think it's a nice place to start because it also reminds us that direct-to-consumer testing, the availability of testing, the democratisation of evidence and how we use it, this is an evolving picture. It changes with equipment, with technology, with attitude, it changes with evidence and with expectations. When I was first a GP, people used to come in and say, could I do a confirmatory test? I don't know whether to believe this one that I've got. Is it good enough? Is your one better? We don't do that anymore. It's changed. And in parallel, what I see is a huge emergence in how much we understand and we know, particularly about early pregnancy loss. I very rarely see a catastrophic bleed or pain that suggests an ectopic pregnancy for someone who didn't know they were pregnant, because they mostly knew. These are invisible advantages and they've changed the way in which we practice. They were expensive, and to some they still are, and I still do see people where it becomes the expectation that they'll do their own pregnancy test, but they might not be able to afford it. We have to remember that this comes into the space. I put blood finger glucose monitors because I think they highlight something else that's come into common use, but the way I encounter them is empowering and enabling people with diabetes who are on medications that can cause hypoglycemia in line with guidance to monitor their own sugar and make adjustments and look after their care. And of course, COVID turned the whole world on its head with us all testing all the time and new ways. I told Fran I'd come up with some vignettes about when I might encounter them in my practice, but I think the first thing I'm going to say is I don't come across them all that often. That's because Oxford's a very unequal city and I work in the very unequal half of it. So I actually don't come across them that often. What I'm going to tell you, there are things that I have come across and that are vignettes. They're fictionalised, but they're based on real encounters. So, Jo's 23, she's really tired, she's got heavy periods, she works shifts. She doesn't really know what to say on the triage form. There are lots of things at play here. We've got menstrual stigma, we've got menstrual etiquette, we've got inflexible triage digital systems, we've got all sorts of things, and we've got people trying to work out how to get a GP appointment and navigate this. So where direct-to-consumer tests come in? She goes online, she buys a ferritin checker, it shows her ferritins in her boots, it gives her the confidence to format the question or some words in which to put it in. She contacts the GP, she gets a blood test, she gets put on a care pathway. That could be a really positive thing, although I still think that there are open questions about the world that creates the space in which that's needed. And questions to be asked about people who wouldn't have known what to look out for, wouldn't have known about that being a test they need or might not be able to afford it. So as these things become expected or embedded, I think we all have some collective questions to ask and some monitoring to do. This is another one. This is actually a little bit more common. Sam's 46, they've noticed their pulse, I can't spell obviously, they've noticed their pulse was irregular on their home blood pressure machine, their smartwatch. They're worried about it, they come to see me. And here we start seeing a slightly complicated interface of tests that I might not be familiar with. I might not trust the technology. I still don't have any clinical context. I still can't make a clinical care plan because I just don't know enough. But we're starting to see an inversion of the traditional order in which I was trained and which I've always worked, which is that you hear somebody's experience, their story, their symptoms, you work out together what tests to do. And I think that that is something that's going to run through my reflections, is this inversion of the order of things. And maybe that's okay, we can learn a different order, but it's uncomfortable for, those of us who've been in the seat for a while. So, they've got an irregular pulse, I don't know whether to trust it, but I think there's enough there for me as a GP that I refer them on, so I'm going to refer to cardiology. They then might have something like a Holter monitor and then go on to see a cardiologist. So what's the other way this scenario plays out? Well, the traditional, the old school way. They've got palpitations, they feel unwell. So same history, I'll have asked them both the same questions. I'll refer them both for a cardiology outpatient monitor, and they'll both be put on a list. But then I get an email back that says, perhaps your patient could buy a handheld pulse monitor. Perhaps they could do some own monitoring to look for atrial fibrillation. If you can capture that, they don't need a monitor. You could see them directly in a cardiology clinic. There's still equity on the surface of it. There's still an open offer on the surface of it. Everybody can have a Holter. Everybody can see a cardiologist. But I think with the ability to finance an alternative, we start to see a subtle shift in which queue people get in, which pathway they're on. And I think that wants a little bit of watching about unintended consequences and new inequities. This one really speaks to the inversion of the way in which we might do tests, or when we're asked to hold responsibility for tests that maybe weren't the ones we would have done, or at least without some foreshadowing or some communication or some dialogue expectation setting. So Liv's 38, she's also tired, everyone's tired. Life is very tiring. She's got a hormonal coil in, so she doesn't bleed very often. She had it since her last pregnancy. But she thinks she might be perimenopausal. The online test gives a borderline FSH result. Again, in a lot of ways, all of these situations create opportunities for conversations, and they therefore become platforms for offering care. They're platforms for dialogue, for consideration, for shared decision-making, for working in partnership with someone. All of that is really positive, and all of that is what we want. And as these become new ways to have that conversation, then I really welcome them. But there's a little bit of potential here to start with a bit of discord, with a mismatched expectation. There's a potential for diagnostic foreshadowing. She's come with a hypothesis. That's not unusual. People often do know, and are usually right about what's going on. But she's got tests to prove it. I think that test is quite hard to interpret in someone who isn't necessarily having a menstrual cycle. We might start out in conflict. We might have to pull back to think about other reasons why she might be tired, why things might be difficult. It might be harder to have that conversation than if we'd done it the other way around. And I don't want to see non-professional to take apart a technology that she's invested faith in and invested money in. It puts us in a slightly uncomfortable position. Finally, this is not unusual, but somebody saw a test online or in the shop. It looked like a good idea. They read about it, they've seen it on social media, but it's quite pricey. They can't afford it. They tell me, I hardly ever use the NHS, I just want you to do this one thing for me. But it's often not a test I can do or in those parameters. And that includes quite a large spectrum of things, and just some that come to mind that I recall being asked about are things like AMH testing outside the constraints of fertility clinic, whole bowel pathogen screening, gut microbiome screening, Tampax screening, vaginal microbiomes. These are all things that people read about that they are told they might want, and often in the context of being told that their GP, they're quite pesky, us GPs, will argue we might not know, we might not value it, we might not have heard of it. That's quite a tricky space to find ourselves in. And often we can't do the tests, and I think that does perhaps have a subtle power to undermine confidence in NHS care, in NHS GPs, that maybe is less productive. It's quite hard to quantify. And finally, I guess an extension of that. Joe's had some tests that they've ordered online and they've got a printout. They can't afford the next thing, whatever the thing that the test said they needed was. And I guess as a GP, I would say they're where everybody's default position, where everybody's backstop and everybody's safety valve. And that is hard at the best of times, but it can be a little bit uncomfortable when they weren't tests that you had done, or that you understand, or that you are certain of the validity of the verification of. That's quite an uncomplicated and almost unnegotiated responsibility, sometimes kind of couched in a language of referral, but it's not an established pathway, and it can be a little bit difficult. I think it also raises the question of which queue people get in more quickly, and whether that pathway is open to everyone when the first step costs money. So I need a scan, can you go straight to it? And I think we also end up having to repeat a lot of tests. So again, they've all got possibilities, they've all got potential, they've all got scope to improve practice given time and to start conversations. But I think within all of them there is some uncertainty. And I guess just thinking about that point, this is the world that I was trained in and that I worked in. I've put up the BMA position statement about the duty of care around test results and drugs. Now, this is for secondary care. And I would say that direct-to-consumer or other sector tests perhaps put this in an uncertain place. But the expectation that I was trained and have always worked under is that the responsibility for a test result is the person who did the test, and that is not a responsibility that can or should be devolved or delegated without a prior agreement. The paper on my left or right, is a paper that I wrote with some colleagues where we started just unearthing some of our reflections about our uncertainty about what happens in the consulting room and in our medical spaces when people are coming in primed with an opposition or an expectation of conflict. And there are many things, I think, that might underpin that. But sometimes in advertising for a thing that is an alternative, you might want to pit yourself against the ordinary thing. And that just does create a new dynamic that I think is a little bit unevaluated and uncertain. So I guess my very last bit of reflection is about what I might read or what I read. Okay, so I look into this stuff a little bit and I've thought about it, but if I was thinking about the things that have just come across my desk kind of on accident as a GP, then it's what I read about in the BMJ. This is certainly what my colleagues who aren't working in research would have seen and what they would see. And the other place that we've come across them locally, and I know that this is not strictly speaking a direct consumer test, but in our locality there was a lot of uncertainty about how to navigate the results of cholesterol point of care testing done by the Our Future Health programme, which gave we didn't know how reliable they were, and I think that was part of the problem, but they were very, very high. We had no forewarning. It generated a lot of anxiety. It helped us identify a lot of people that we could have really good conversations with about cholesterol, about lifestyle. So a lot of good came from it. But there were a lot of people who had quite a frightening or an uncertain experience, who didn't need that care, who didn't go on to need anything. It took up a lot of time. And I think it probably left them with some residual anxiety, and I don't know how we pull that back. It has also left a residual atmosphere of uncertainty, I would say, amongst clinicians, certainly in my practice. And I just pulled up these two BMJ reviews about the validity of direct-to-consumer tests, because they were things that I came across because I genuinely do read the BMJ on a Saturday morning. And I'm just going to draw this conclusion. So clinicians working downstream of self-tests are likely to face important challenges in incorporating results in practice. And I think that's what I've been trying to just highlight and to just reflect on a tiny bit today. I'm just going to finish. I'm very glad to see Sabrina in the audience because this is Sabrina and Rosa's work. But I'm just going to finish with the reflections for some work that we did, perhaps as an example of this, about home Doppler devices, so the little devices that you use to measure the fetal heart rate in pregnancy, that are not only not sanctioned in guidance, they are actively prohibited. So all clinical guidance says just don't use them, they're not safe. There are fears about delayed care seeking, about misinterpretation of the results, perhaps a little bit of medical paternalism there. But also the idea that this bit of testing is just one facet of a clinical assessment, and we almost are reductive in saying it can be just replaced by this one handheld device. But despite all that, they're really widely and broadly available with absolutely no regulation. People use them. Clinicians know people use them, but they know that people know that they shouldn't be using them. And they get themselves in a quagmire of secrecy, which might just represent missed chances to explore what led the person to use the test, what they were worried about, what their thoughts and their needs were, and how they'd got into this place. So I do think it just risks a paradox that in the pursuit of safety, we reduce chances to discuss things that might enable safety. Thank you.